Hello everybody, my name is Ben Warwa. I will be talking about mobile device malware today. This is for the class CFS 485, Mobile Device Security and Forensics, taught by Brian Hill at Metro State in St. Paul, Minnesota. Quick disclaimer, this is for educational purposes only, and I'm not responsible for any damages that this may cause. So I will talk a little bit about what malware is to start off with, the various different types of malware, the various attack vectors that attackers may use. I'll talk about how iOS malware has advanced in the recent years. I'll give specific examples of Android and iOS malware, how they work and what they do, how you can stay a little bit safer day to day, and finally I have a few application recommendations that might be helpful in your pursuit to stay safe. So let's start. What is malware? Well, malware is any program or file that is harmful to a computer user. In recent years, more malware has been found on mobile devices, and there are no boundaries anymore. So you need to be diligent on any device you may use. And malware affects mobile devices in a similar way that they affect computers now. So a lot of time, SMS phishing is a big thing now, whereas before, email phishing on computers was really the only phishing variant that there was. And this shows that there are many various different attack vectors, but we'll go into that a little later. So let's start with the types of malware. So I just have a few types here. So let's start with spyware. Spyware monitors the user and records information, can gain access to cameras and microphones. This is really invasive. It's really nasty. A lot of the time I've seen it used, I've heard it used in digital espionage stories, but it's not limited to that, not at all. Next we'll go into adware. Adware is the constant advertisements are shown, often not leading to what they advertise. They often use malvertisement, and what malvertisement is exactly that. So advertisements that advertise one thing bring you to another place, and they may bring you to infected websites or download something onto your computer that you may not necessarily want. And a lot of times adware will take up a lot of screen space, which can be really intrusive, can lead you to accidentally clicking the apps, which isn't good. Banker malware. Banker malware is specifically designed to steal bank credentials without the user knowing. It's dangerous, especially if you have a mobile banking app on your phone, because if elevated privileges are granted to the malware, it's possible that they can just go into your account and withdraw money straight from that application. Rooting malware is also really dangerous. It's the last thing you want because it unlocks the operating system and allows attackers escalated privileges. They can then run adware, delete or install apps, and gather confidential information. This is specifically bad due to the fact that it can be the first phase of an attack, because then they can install whatever apps they want, which can lead to Trojans, it can lead to spyware, banker malware, can lead to anything, so it's really quite dangerous. So how do they get these attacks onto your device? Let's go through a couple attack vectors. Phishing is the biggest one. It's so prominent, and it's one of the most prominent ways on mobile. This is due to SMS phishing. So oftentimes you can get a text from a strange number saying, "Hey, was this you? Click this link. This might be you," or something along those lines. You click the link, it'll go and install a malicious APK onto your device, and then you're screwed. And for this reason, I personally think that the weakest part of the system is the human, since we can be manipulated by social engineering, whereas the computer can't. So you really need to stay on top of phishing, and know the strategies that are being used, know what to look out for, because it's really, really important. Next is drive-by downloads. This sees the file being downloaded without your consent, usually in the background of an infected website. So this will usually take advantage of browsers, applications, and operating systems with security flaws. And this is a good example of where phishing may bring you, is to a drive-by download site where you may have a piece of spyware downloaded onto your phone or device without you knowing. Now, I wanted to bring up typo squatting as well. I haven't seen any examples of it, but I know it's prominent on computers. Knowing where mobile device malware is going, it's important. It's important to keep it in your mind because it's very possible that there are certain websites that you go on more often than not on your mobile device where a typo squatter may be sitting waiting for you to accidentally fat finger a key on your mobile keyboard and end up on their infected website, which is really dangerous. I just wanted to put it on there to keep it in your mind. And then there's malvertising, which we talked a little bit about before. They're advertisements placed on websites that don't take you where they advertise, and it's another way you could run into a drive-by download. So they bring you to a website that'll just download something in the background, and it usually involves an infected website of some sorts. So they'll be placed on infected websites. And then lastly, we have Trojans. So Trojans are the primary delivery method on mobile, and they're often disguised as reputable applications. This is more so on Android than iOS due to the Google Play Store not being as heavily vetted as the iOS App Store. But you really need to be careful on what you're downloading, especially on Google Play. But not only Google Play, you also need to be careful on the iOS App Store as well. But we'll go into that a little bit later. And one thing I wanted to bring up is a lot of times in seeking higher security, you'll download security apps. And if you go into the Google Play Store and you type in security, there are so many applications. And a lot of times these applications will require elevated privileges. I know specifically Avast will ask access to your camera, access to basically all your files, which is really dangerous if it wasn't a secure application. So if the application was compromised, you may just be granting that malware elevated privileges without knowing it. So you really need to be careful. You need to do your research before installing any applications like that want higher level access to your phone. And no device is safe. Before 2016, only jailbroken iPhones were vulnerable. And this was due to jailbreaking, allowing root access a lot of the times. The application manager for jailbroken devices, Cydia, would contain malicious websites or malicious applications. And up until 2016, there was no application that did this on a non-jailbroken phone. But this isn't the case anymore. Infected applications are getting around the iOS App Store vetting process, and of course Android is just as vulnerable. And this is mainly due to the creative attack vectors and the exploitation of specific iOS services. So Ace Deceiver was the malware that first did this. It's the first family of malware to infect non-jailbroken iPhones. Malware before Ace Deceiver abused enterprise certificates to install on jailbroken devices. Ace Deceiver installs itself without enterprise certificates using flaws in Apple's DRM mechanism instead, fair play. And it didn't necessarily coin the term fair play man in the middle, but it uses the fair play man in the middle technique. The fair play man in the middle attack sees hackers using authentication codes from the App Store apps to simulate an iTunes client to trick iOS devices into thinking the app was bought by the user. This method has been around, but primarily to pirate App Store apps without paying for them, of course. But Ace Deceiver was the first application to actually use this feature maliciously. And it kind of set an example. I read on Palo Alto that it feared the copycats, essentially. And it feared that we would start seeing many more attacks just like this. And we have been. And so we'll go into the next one. So, going into more iOS malware, I'm going to talk a little bit about DualToy. DualToy installs through sideloading, which installs itself on the DualToy malware itself installs itself on a computer in which iTunes is installed, and then waits for a USB connection to be placed from the computer to an iPhone, and it will then install itself on the phone. Once it's installed, it installs numerous Chinese game apps. And as far as I can tell, they're not malicious at all. For whatever reason, it just installs Chinese game apps, whether that be a calling card or what. But once it's installed, it starts collecting device and system data, which, of course, is never good. Moving on to WireLurker. It lies dormant in a Mac device and waits for the iOS device to be connected. And it infects currently installed apps and generates new malicious apps. When it's installed, it collects hardware information and contact information from received text messages. And this is a good example of how attackers are getting around iOS safeguards by sideloading. That's a big thing you'll see in iOS is the sideloading thing, because computers are super vulnerable. It's a great way to get into the iOS platform. And since most users with iTunes will eventually plug in their iPhone to their phone to sync it, it's a great attack vector. And we'll move on to Xcode Ghost. Now, this is a really creative attack vector. It's the first compiler malware in OS X, and it was repackaged into some versions of the Xcode installer. And essentially why it's so creative is it infected applications at the source. So it infected the packages distributed to developers making genuine apps. And at least 2 apps were submitted and passed Apple's code review that were created with the infected Xcode packages. So this means they essentially infected the app developers, who then got their apps to pass that were using the Xcode installer into the App Store. So it really shows how careful you have to be when you're downloading apps, not on Android only, but on iOS now. And once it's installed, it collects system and app information from the phone. So let's move on to some Android malware. We're going to start off with HeroRat. It's a remote access Trojan. Its source code was posted in hacking channels, which is really dangerous. It originally sold for $650 on certain hacking Telegram channels, so it was available to anyone who had the cash, which is pretty scary. And it led to many variants of the attack. It was written in C#, and it used the Telesharp library to create Telegram bots. And once the malware is installed, it pops up a fake uninstall message thinking that you've uninstalled it. Once you click it, it stays running in the background and continues to capture files, text messages, and can even obtain your GPS location, which is scary. And the fact that it is so readily available to people in the hacking channels to redistribute to victims is not good. Next one is Zoo Park. Zoo Park is primarily used in a cyber espionage operation since 2015, and it has evolved. So in the recent versions, as you can see in the picture to the left there, it installs, or it has gained new features to obtain data from its victim. And it utilizes malicious links and watering hole attacks to get victims to download. And the latest update sees Zoo Park extracting call logs, messages, browser data, makes silent audio calls, extracts call data, steals usernames, passwords, and even captures photos and screenshots. And so let's start with the watering hole attack, just in case you don't know what that is. A popular site is inserted with malicious APKs that download when a victim visits the website. It's pretty similar to a drive-by download. And not a lot of infections have been reported, luckily, which means that this specific piece of malware has been used on specific targets. But it's still really dangerous, as you can see. It collects so much data. It can make silent audio calls, so it can listen in on you at any time. And it's really a good example of how damaging malware can be. The idea that this would be circulating within the hacker channels like Hero Rat was is terrifying, because that would mean a lot of people would have a lot of data on the victims. And it just shows how dangerous the freedom that the Android gives you can be a blessing and a curse, because the more control you have means the more control that a malicious application can have. Alright, so we'll move on to how to stay safe. So you want to research your application authenticity before downloading, and I cannot stress this enough. It's super important to know how authentic your applications are before you give them any higher level privileges or anything else. And just do your research before you download anything, especially third party, because I know Androids allow for third party application downloading from websites and everything, but you really need to be careful with those especially. Encrypt your data. It doesn't hurt. iOS is encrypted on the chipset level, and Android, they both allow you to go into the settings and encrypt all your data, and you definitely should. Remote wipes are offered on most phones, so if you go into your computer, usually there is you can either find an application, or on iTunes you can remote wipe with Find My iPhone, I believe. And it's just nice, just in case your phone gets super infected and you don't want any more data lost than it already has been. A remote wipe is always nice. And then educate yourself on common phishing and scareware tactics. This is really important, just to know what to look for when phishing and scammers come to try to get you to click on their links or give you a call, tell you to go to this website, that you know what not to do in those situations, because it's in those situations that you can lose the most data. And that's why it's so important for companies now to communicate the risks and dangers of phishing emails to employees. The same preparations should be observed in your day-to-day activities as well. And be aware of false ads or malvertisement. It's the same thing. Just be careful not to click on anything that isn't legit. You want to be careful of where you're going as well on the internet, so that you don't end up on a website that has malvertisements. And then, of course, you can monitor your application activity. Like we saw before, applications will often want elevated privileges, and a lot of times malware will continuously ask until you eventually either give up or you click it, just accidentally click it or whatever. Once it's there, you're going to want to be able to monitor and take off that elevated privilege of that application. So there are a few applications that might help, and I have them listed here. So there are app ops. It's a permissions monitor for Android. It's pretty useful. You can go through each application and see what permissions applications have. The app permissions manager is similar. It's just nice to have two of them. And then Avast is very useful. It comes with application scanning, which is really nice. So once you do download your vetted app, you can scan it just to be sure. I know there have been vetted apps that have been compromised in the past, such as CCleaner. CCleaner was redistributed with some malware, I think back in 2017, I want to say. And it's just nice to have that extra layer of security. It also scans for vulnerabilities on your device as well, and it comes with nice anti-theft features. And it's an example of one of the applications that want a lot of the elevated privileges just so that it can use its whole host of features. So you have to be really careful. So in conclusion, I talked about what malware is, the different types of malware, various attack vectors, and that attackers will use. I talked about iOS malware and how it's advanced in the recent years. I gave specific examples of a few different types of malware, how they work, and what they do. And how to stay a little safer, as well as a list of a few apps that I personally like to use to monitor my devices. And as attack vectors change and become more creative, it's important to stay vigilant on how attacks are happening so that you can stay safe and uncompromised. Thank you.